Hello, Shannon here. I told you on my last video that I would be back in a few days to do another cover of the movie Knives Out, and I'm going to explain some of the hidden things that God has put in these movies. I would call this series God's Subliminal Messages. I know this is going to seem strange because it hasn't been out there, but a few years ago I started seeing really the Bible in so many ways in the movies that I would go see. And for a while it really popped out at me like two separate movies, and I mean it was almost like a 3D type of popping out at me. It was very weird. I was fasting at the time while bodybuilding, and so I think that right now, because I haven't been fasting and doing my bodybuilding, it's not as pronounced. But I'm going to get back to that fasting, and I think that it will be more pronounced and I'll get better at it. But I'm going to do what I have right now. I will tell you that I've watched this movie about 8 times to cover it and know it backwards and forwards and get everything I can get out of it to share with you. And so with no further ado, I'm going to start. I will say that the two-house theory is in this movie, and that would be the house of Harlan. Now, let me just stop for a minute. If you haven't seen this movie, please go watch it first, at least once before you watch this video, and then afterwards go watch it again and see if the things that I bring out are much more visible to you. Okay, so Harlan is one house. He's the head, he's the father. The other house is the one he gives everything to. That would be Marta, and her name means mistress or lady of the house. These meanings of the names to me are very important because they give you an insight to the character of the person. Harlan means dweller by the boundary wood or rocky land. Thromby, the last name, means seriousness, thought, intuition, intent, wisdom, a very special person who often relies on intuition for decision making. Your mind is rich and deep, but often closed for other people. You sometimes need seclusion in order to gain clarity about what is going on in your life. This, however, does not make you a person that is hard to get along with. On the contrary, you have many talents and can always tell what others are feeling. In love and relationships, you tend to be very passionate. Now, this is what the name Thromby, the last name, means. Harlan is the dweller by the boundary wood. Now, wood takes me to Yeshua. I would say that there is duality in the character of Harlan, because before he basically slits his own throat, he's playing the part of basically the serpent. And I will tell you by what he tells Marta. He says he should have been nicer to the family, like Marta suggested. He should have encouraged Walter to write his own books, like Marta told him. He said he tried to keep them beneath him. Now remember, the father puts the children before him. So he's basically saying he wished he'd been a father and not just a provider. Provider being physical, father being spiritual. Harlan says that Ransom is just like him. Ransom's the character in the movie who ends up being the murderer. And we'll talk about him here in a little bit. Now remember, I'm going over characters. I'm going over positions. And in my previous videos, I talk about how we're all playing a part, and the question is, which part are we playing? So I'm talking about parts. I wanted to talk about the two houses. Harlan is playing one house before he slits his throat, but he's handing the house over to Marta. She's the other house. I believe Harlan represents the house of Judah. Marta represents the house of Israel. Spiritually, Harlan is the physical house. Marta is the spiritual house. Harlan's playing the part of Adam, and Marta is playing the part of Eve. So if you have watched my previous videos where I talk about these biblical things, then you'll understand more of what I'm sharing with you in this movie. Okay, Harlan says, Ransom is just like him. He's confident, stupid, protected, playing life like a game without consequence until you can't tell the difference between a stage prop and a real knife. When he says this to Marta later, it occurs to me that he set it all up. That Ransom, he said, is just like him. This is one part of what Ransom is playing, where he's like Adam. He's serving one God in the Bible, the God that Harlem represents, the God of flesh, whereas Marta represents the God of spirit. And I believe when he starts writing, when the medicine is switched and all these things that happen in the movie, he says, oh, that sounds like a good movie. And he predicts in his writing that at the end, Ransom is going to mistake the fake knife, the real knife for a fake knife, or the fake knife as a real knife. And I'm going to talk about that knife, because when we persecute others for transgressions, that's a fake knife. We're stabbing somebody for something that may not be the truth. He's tried to stab her in the end in her heart. Her heart was pure. She didn't need to be stabbed in the heart. So you can see it like that if you'd like. That's the way I partook that Harlan's writing the story. And he was famous for playing games. That game that he played with Marta, basically I took as the game of life. And Marta's, he asks her, why, I don't understand why you beat me all the time. She says, because I'm not playing to beat you. I'm playing to make beautiful patterns. This is the difference between those who love and those who don't. Those who do not play the game for making beautiful patterns are playing a game to win. They're playing a game to beat other people rather than to be the best they can be and be beautiful. And this is why she's won the game. She is playing the game of life by playing it through love. It's the law of love. She's a servant. She's laying her life down. She's also a foreigner. And we'll talk about that for just a minute. Her kind of foreigner is she is a foreigner to the physical world, the physical land. Those who choose the physical wealth are the ones in control of the physical land because that's their priority. Those who choose the spiritual wealth, that is what they are over because that's what they choose. And that's back to Adam and Eve. Adam chose the physical wealth and Eve chose the spiritual wealth. Flesh and spirit. This is not about man or woman, and we can talk about the Bible. Harlan is portraying the house of Judah, which would be the physical Jew. Are all Jews serving the serpent spirit? No, it's just a representation of one house, but both houses exist in each side. Then we have Marta, who is playing the part of Israel, located in the second house, Christianity. But are all Christians walking in love? No, they are not. So both houses are in each side. It's that each side is representing the male and the female. But we have both within us. So again, this is about the house of Judah, flesh, and the house of Israel, spirit. And I'm speaking in spiritual terms, not physical. So that's the two-house theory. Now, let's talk about the replacement theology before I get into the details of the movie. The replacement theology is God's replacement theology, but it's not Christians replacing Jews. It's those who walk in love replacing those who do not, the fleshly nature. Because those who walk in love, like Eve, get a double portion. They get the spiritual wealth because they understand they're seers. I'm a seer. I'm showing you how to see God's story in a movie, which this is a series I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be taking many movies and doing the same thing. And it'll be a different topic because God doesn't cover every topic in every movie. But he hits highlights. And he does it through man. It's hidden, just like the New Testament is hidden underneath the Old. It's the soul level interpretation. So the replacement theology, what is Harlan doing? He's replacing the house that he represents before he kills himself. Just like Yeshua on the cross Before he dies, he represents the firstborn of the fleshly nature. He dies for all of those of the fleshly nature. He was there to save those of the fleshly nature. But how does he save them? When they become the spiritual. When he resurrects, it's of the spiritual nature. The flesh gets death, like Adam, and the spirit gets life and great pain and suffering, like Eve. So all of these things are covering the same thing. Let's see. Harlan changed his will 1 week before he died, and the death investigation happened a week after. This is 2 sets of 7, death and burial. The third 7 is resurrection. Harlan insisted that Marta play his game on his birthday, 85 years old. If you add 8 and 5, that's 13. 13 is the number for love. And I just thought that that was, you know, you see a lot of videos where people are adding numbers and they're bringing meaning. And there is something to that, so I'm covering all of these things. He tells her she wins more than Ransom. Okay, now Ransom also played the game with his father. Well, flesh plays the game of life with flesh the same way. Sometimes they beat each other and sometimes the other wins. But they're playing the same game. They're playing to win for themselves. They're not playing a life where they're being their best just to be their best. They're competing. And in life, we're not supposed to compete with each other. We're just supposed to be better than we ourselves were the day before. We have succeeded in life when we become better. The way to become better is to learn and do our mikvah by covering in the water of forgiveness. Forgiveness is the most important thing. Without forgiveness, you cannot grow. And I've watched this in people. I've watched people who refuse to forgive to decline in life instead of grow. So this is very important. And I already covered that he wondered why he wonders why he can't beat Martha at the game. And again, she wins because she plays to make beautiful patterns. We who love are playing the game of life to make the world beautiful. We are those who keep the world looking most like Eden. Why are we not in Eden? Because we have people who are hating. When everybody is walking in love, we are in the paradise of Eden. Okay, now I will say Marta witnessed Harlan kill himself both physically and spiritually. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, she saw him slit his throat. That's a gimme. She tried to keep him from doing it. She tried twice to call for help, and he wouldn't let her. Because he knew that if he didn't make a clean slate and do that, that she wouldn't get the inheritance. And I'm trusting that everybody who's watching this video already knows what happened in the movie, and if you don't, please go back and watch it, because it's really a good movie to explain the spiritual things in. There's a lot going on. Okay, so she's a nurse. Marta's a nurse who administers pain meds. Always the correct amount, 3 milligrams, as opposed to the 100 overdose. Now, I like to look at the 3 as Father, Son, Holy Spirit. When we are all doing our job, walking in love, we are administering pain medicine to the lost. And the correct dose would be the 3, which would be Father, Son, Holy Spirit, as opposed to the 1 in 100, me, myself, and I. That's an overdose. And so when we're trying to soothe somebody in a spiritual manner who's in pain and suffering, we need to have a bit of understanding, and we need to share with them why we need to be nicer and all of these things that Harlan tells Marta, that he wished he'd listened to her to fix things, and that he always wanted everybody to be beneath him. And we'll talk about his publishing company, because I liken the publishing company to his books that, you know, his son published and that his son ran as the Old Testament, because his son is writing his words. And remember, he represents the serpent before he dies. He represents the one who puts everybody beneath him rather than before him. The Father puts others before him, not beneath him. So we'll discuss that in a minute, because there's room in this movie to speculate what comes after Martha gets her inheritance. And again, I discussed that Martha's name means mistress or lady of the house. I'm reading notes so that I don't forget anything. The detective asked her how many hours she worked. She said she was hired for 15 hours, but more later because Harlan needed a friend. And remember, we have a friend in Yeshua, salvation and redemption, the one that operates as a servant in love. And the number 15 is the number for Yah, which means God in Hebrew. So she's saying she needed to be a little above a number 15, which adds to 6, man's number. So she's going above and beyond the call of a human, which would be equivalent to 666, me, myself, and I. She's being a friend. And if you go back to my video on Queen Esther's, when the husband, he says that he needs a wife who's going to be a better neighbor. That's going to be someone who's a friend. So all these things are key things that if you are really basking in your word and really just flavoring the moment of how beautiful it is, that's how you can see these things. If you have these things on your mind, you can still enjoy the things that the earth has to offer. God said he created the world for his son, Jesus. Do you think he just meant the Jesus, the man? Yeshua is a spirit of salvation and redemption. And if salvation and redemption through love lives in you, you are the son too. He created the world for us to enjoy, not turn our backs on. And you can't enjoy something like what I'm sharing with you if you don't go. I love movies, and I will forever go watch movies. And I will see these things that God has put in there. It's called the land of Israel. Only those with eyes to see and ears to hear are going to see these things. And so I believe it's my calling to share these things with you. Okay, so let me see where I have left off. She tried to get help. Harlan stopped her twice. She also tried to help Fran. Now, Fran is the housekeeper. What does a housekeeper do? They keep the house clean. So let's talk about why Fran dies. Fran's supposed to keep the house clean. Let's think spiritually, clean and unclean. How do you keep the house clean? It's called covering rather than exposing. And what is Fran doing? She is basically threatening Ransom that she's going to expose him because she's seeing rather than being blind. Remember, Yeshua said, if you weren't so, you wouldn't be so knee deep in your sin if you were blind. This is what he's referring to, being blind to the wrongdoing. Now, it's not wrong to tell that somebody may have had something to do with a murder. That's not what she was threatening to do. She wanted money. And so, therefore, she's of the fleshly nature. Therefore, she can't keep a fleshly house clean. She's unclean. So, that's why she dies. She's the unclean and she dies. And she's the replacement for Ransom, who I believe is playing a duality part because of the definition of his name. And we'll get into that in a minute. Where did I stop? Oh, Marta, the mistress of the house, cannot tell a lie. Because if she lies, she will throw up. It makes her sick. Now, remember the scripture that says, God says, I'm not a man that I should lie. And, you know, going back to what I spoke about Adam and Eve, Adam blamed flesh and God. But the word says we're fighting principalities and powers, not flesh and blood. And Eve exposed the enemy and herself rather than her neighbor, Adam, and her maker. So she told the truth. She had her waist girded with truth. And Adam told a lie. So this right here again is something that you wouldn't see unless you knew your word and you were really basking in what it was. And of course, a lot of people have not yet heard my breakdown of Adam and Eve. Now, when it's out, and it will be out, more will understand and understand it to be what I've said it to be. Now let's talk about Marta. She's had blood on her shoe from Harlem, which could be symbolic of the blood on your doorpost. Now let's talk about the doorpost. Our body is our temple. If we are to have blood on our doorpost, blood represents a sacrifice. Now, Marta was the sacrificial lamb in the house, which is why she was passed over as far as being cut out of the house. She was protected from being killed. She has that blood on her shoe. Shoe is a covering for the feet. Feet are the ones that does the walking. You either walk God's way or you don't. When you're walking in love, your feet are covered. And she was a sacrificial person in the home. Why? When the investigator asks her about the investigation of all the family members, she says, well, if you ask me, no one in the house is a murderer. She's covering for everyone. She's the sacrificial lamb. She's the one willing to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, even if it costs her wealth. And she did it on several occasions. So that would be your Passover for today, which starts Passover. So I wanted to cover the two houses, replacement theology, which is God's replacement theology. It is a theology, and it is covered through the Word. It is a true thing. But God has given us the opportunity to change from the fleshly nature to the spiritual, and I do believe that everybody eventually becomes the spiritual and gets an inheritance, just not all at the same time. We have to learn our own lessons in our own timing. That's where God says, remember that I'm the one that led you out of Egypt by my hands, by the physical, fleshly. Okay, so when you walk in hate, you can close the door. But when you walk in love, your door can be opened. Because this is our temple. This is where God wants to live. Just imagine if everyone allowed the spirit of love to live within their body. We would have a world that is a church. Because we are the church. That which is within us says what kind of church we are. So building a building for God, a physical building, that's not what was ever wanted. And while we're talking about that, let's just say this. Harlan represents the testimony of the Old Testament, Adam's testimony of the flesh. When Jesus or Yeshua in the New Testament says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, he is not pointing back to the Old Testament. Those are two wines. There's a wine of the Old Testament, that's life, and there's life in the New Testament. One's physical, one is spiritual, and we are not to mix the two wines. So when Yeshua is saying, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, he's not pointing back to the Old Testament. He's pointing to himself. When you see what I've done, you've seen what the Father would do, because the Spirit of the Father is within me. That's what sets him apart from the Old Testament face value. He's hidden because the Old Testament is a testimony of rules and regulations which give you the knowledge of good and evil, which was Adam's testimony. It was this woman that you gave me that did evil. That's a testimony of the difference of the knowledge of good and evil. So I am really trying through this video and this movie to make it clear. You do have two different halves of the book. God said the first will be last, the last will be first. The first testimony was given by the last. Those of the fleshly nature. They gave their testimony first. Now, does that mean that everybody in the Old Testament doing feasts and festivals is bad? No. No. This is not about religion. This is about relationship, and I don't care where you are in any land, there are people who walk in love and who don't. And you can tell when you walk in a land how much love is there by how cultivated the land is. Because it takes love and cooperation to cultivate a land. It takes people yielding to each other and understanding the talents of each other and letting them do their part and do it well and working together to cultivate a land. So we can talk about that later, but I'm just saying both are in both parts. But we need to be able to dissect the Bible correctly so that everybody can get on the right path together. No matter what religion you are, religion was made by man. It was for man. You don't think that God could tell each kind of person where he put them? He put them in the belly of the woman who was a Muslim, who was a Catholic, who was a Jew, who was a Hindu, and all the other religions. He put them there. He knew where they were. It was not about that religion. But God also gave the story, the same story, to many different cultures and peoples. And, I've heard in listening to different videos how one group of people thought, well, the story of Jesus was stolen by this one because of what they had. Well, I want to know, why is it that God couldn't have given that same story to both kinds of people? It's his story. So why wouldn't he give it to everybody in the way they could understand it? Which is why I am doing what I'm doing, because I don't think there's anybody that can't understand the difference between people who hate and people who love. It's a gimme. There is a clear-cut difference in the two kinds of people. So let's move on. Ransom, which is the bad, well, I say the bad guy. He's the spoiled kid in the bunch. But I believe he has a duality meaning, because his name Ransom means to redeem or deliver someone from punishment for sin. A person who holds someone in exchange for a ransom is called a ransomer. His first name, hue, is a color or shade, the attribute of a color by virtue of which it is discernible as red, green, etc., and which is dependent on its dominant wavelength and independent of intensity and lightness. And hue represents to me the code many colors. Yeshua was the ransom. His death was the ransom. That physical death. Well, in this movie, I wondered, well, why does the bad guy's name mean what Yeshua's name basically is? And it's because he's playing the dual part of Yeshua. Physically, he's a brat, he's spoiled, he doesn't work, and he's blessed with everything he needs. Well, spiritually, the man that doesn't work doesn't eat. What does eat mean? It's the word akal. It means consume and devour, just like Adam. The Sabbath, where we're not supposed to work, was made for man. What did Adam do? He consumed and devoured his neighbor and maker. The man that doesn't work doesn't eat. So spiritually speaking, if he's not working, he's not consuming and devouring his neighbor and maker. Now, I believe that ransom really represents more of the opposite of Yeshua, but there's duality in all of us. We have a fleshly nature that we're fighting every day, but we have a spiritual nature that can take over when we do our best to walk the way of love. And then eventually our flesh falls under the rule of our spirit. And that's towards the end of our life, after we've learned all these ugly lessons that we wish at the end of our life that we hadn't even done in the first place. But that's what life is for, to learn the lesson. Okay, let's see, where else am I? Let's see. Okay, Drysdale is a name. It means a river, and a dale, or meaning valley. And Drysdale is the last name of Harlan's daughter's husband, Richard. We're going to talk about Richard and Linda for a minute too, here in a minute. But let me finish with Ransom. Ransom told the help to call him Hugh, his first name. Harlan told Ransom that he did not beat him at his game as much as Marta. Okay, we already covered that. Ransom burns the building down that had the proof of Marta's innocence. Okay, I want to talk about that for a minute, because in the movie, Ransom already knows about the switching of the medicine, and we're going to talk about that for a minute, because remember, Yeshua says to be equally yoked. And, you know, you have a certain kind of pain medicine that you administer to people who are hurting. And then there's the other medicine that after judgment you administer to those who have been using that judgment, because what we give, we get. So Yeshua says to be equally yoked, but in Adam and Eve, we know they're not equally yoked. One is walking in the fleshly nature, one is walking in the spiritual nature. Now, we know that Ransom switched the medicine, but Marta delivered the right medicine because she'd been doing it so long. But symbolically, I believe that is, symbolism of when Yeshua said to be equally yoked. And, in the movie, eventually, Harlan tells his daughter, Linda, in a letter, that her husband, Richard, is having an affair with a foreigner. Now, let's talk about that. Richard was written out of the will. Harlan said he built his fortune from the ground up. Remember, Adam is of the ground, and I believe that Eve represented the spirit. From Adam to Eve, he's built his business, from the fleshly nature to the spiritual. Once he slits his throat and he gives the house over to Marta, the house becomes what? Spiritual. So this is going from the old man to the new man in this movie. Richard is having an affair with a foreigner, but this foreigner is not equal to the foreigner of Marta and her family, who are foreigners. Richard represents the fleshly nature, but his wife, Linda, she built her business from the ground up. She is like her father. And this is where you have the daughters of men. Okay, men is in Adam. Who's the first daughter of men? Eve. She came out of him. Come out of her, my people. This is what this is referring to, the spiritual coming out of the fleshly nature. And so the father tells her in a letter it's time for her to untether herself from Richard. It's time to be done. There's only so much administering the right kind of medicine, the 3 milligrams as opposed to the 100, which is an overdose, which kills. Now, if you speak of that in terms of the other kind of killing, spiritual killing, it can be circumcision of the heart. But the person circumcised in the heart was actually Harlan. And then there's Linda, the daughter, who built her own fortune. But then there's also his son, Walt. And we're going to talk about Walt in a minute. I talked about Fran. Spiritually, Fran is... Okay, I talked about Fran not doing her job at all. And really, the true housekeeper was actually Marta. She kept the house clean. And because she became unclean so that they could be seen as clean, she gets the inheritance. Okay, so I talked about that. Okay. Let's talk about the 2 police officers and then the one that's hired. Blanc is the one that's privately hired by Ransom, which isn't known in the beginning. Okay, he says, I observe facts without biases of head knowledge, tree of knowledge, or heart. I determine the path, and truth falls at my feet. And, it's funny that he says that because in the movie, the dog actually drops a piece of the evidence at his feet. So I thought that was funny because later they show this. But I would liken Blanc to those who are watchers, and the 2 officers, the sergeant and the lieutenant, the law or the officers of the Old Testament that are just looking for physical evidence. Blanc is looking at the heart as well before he decides, because he says in the movie the first day that he knew there was more to the story than what Marta was saying because she had the blood on her shoe. But he didn't say because of that she had something to do with it. At first he listened to all the evidence. And speaking of that, when you're studying the Bible, you're listening to people. I was in the Messianic movement for a very long time, listening to many, many teachers who had already basically decided that going back to the Old Testament was correct. It was, doing the feasts and festivals was the only way to be God's people. But I felt the investigation was not over. I needed to see the investigation to the end before coming to the conclusion. And I would liken myself to Blanc, who is investigating all the way to the end and not making, early judgments without all the evidence. Okay, he says, my presence will be ornamental. And I like the fact that he uses this word, because when you accuse someone else, like Adam, when he says it was this woman you gave me, he's covering himself with an ornament. She's the light, and ornaments light up. And so there's that scripture in the Old Testament that talks about how God doesn't like the tree, with the lights on it. He's not speaking about a Christmas tree. He is speaking about those people who are pointing fingers and accusing others and blaming them instead of them pointing their finger at themselves, because they're using other people as ornaments. So Blanc is saying he's an ornament. He's a light. He says, my presence will be ornamental. You will find me a respectful, quiet, passive observer of the truth. What have God's people been? Respectful, ornamental, quiet, passive observers of the truth. He's also a self-made man. Blanc wants Marta to be with him as he investigates the grounds. Adam, the fleshly nature. He trusts her heart, and because she had nothing to gain by killing him, which she didn't. She tried to save him. She didn't want him to die. She shed tears over his death. She was the one there nursing him back to health, not just physically, but spiritually. And that's the part we're talking about today. So, and I liken this to Yeshua, who's walking with us every day in our lives, covering our mishaps and our missteps, like basically Marta did in the movie when she goes with him through the grounds to retrace all of the things, and she ends up covering things. And then there's a part in there where Blanc says that dogs are a good judge of character, and dog means all heart, lev in Hebrew. And, the dogs didn't bark at Marta, but they barked at Ransom. And showing that, it takes one to know one. A dog that's all heart is going to know someone that's all heart. So, all of these things are biblical. These things are things that God is showing us in the everyday entertainment. And I do not believe the people that wrote these movies knew this stuff was in there. They're writing a movie man-made. But God is writing his movie through these men that's hidden underneath, just like the soul level interpretation of the Old Testament is the New Testament. In the New Testament, you have the Old Testament feasts and festivals hidden in it. But the problem I have with that is this. When Yeshua came to teach and show us an example of how to live, he didn't hide what we needed to know. But the enemy hides what we need to know. And the first testimony of Adam, who is serving the enemy, has hidden the things that we need to know. The two books go together, but you need to know how to see what's going on in the page. You're still going to see a little bit of both in each side. Just like I said, there's both those who hate and both those who love in each side. It was never about a religion. It's always been about relationship. And God describing to us how to have a relationship in a loving way, and what it means to not have that relationship. Okay, I want to talk about Walt. Well, let me first make sure I finish with Blanc. Oh, and this side room up to Harlan's room. It took 3 flights of stairs, and, to me, it looked like you had to go up to the 3rd heaven to talk with Harlan. And you've got 2 people that both went up there to talk to him. You've got the one that represents the fleshly nature, but again, Ransom played both parts from the definition of his name, redeem, because the flesh, he's redeeming us from the fleshly nature. But then our spiritual nature rises to live again. But they both go up the side door, which is a secret door, which to me pointed to, maybe going up to the Holy of Holies. She was in the room. She played the game. She won more often because of her character. I believe that Marta represents the Holy Spirit. I believe that Ransom could have represented Yeshua, both sides of him. Because what does he do? He goes to prison. Yeshua went to prison too. Now, he didn't literally kill anyone. He was actually the one killed. But I'm just saying that some parts, you see the duality that they're playing. He actually killed one that was, Ransom did kill a guilty party, but she was guilty spiritually because she was seeing what he did and using it for finances. She was not keeping the house clean. Okay, Walt is the one who's in charge of the publishing house. And let's see, what is the name of that publishing house? That's very interesting. I know I have it here. It has to do with... I'll find it in a minute. Walt always said that the real wealth in the publishing company was an adaptation of Harlan's books. And I liken this to the New Testament as opposed to the Old Testament. The Old Testament being the books that would be from one father, and then the New Testament being the adaptation written on the son's side, which Walt is playing that part, and his son's name is Jacob, which I don't think is an accident. Basically, Harlan says he doesn't think it's fair to keep Walt tethered to him, something that's not his. In other words, those books were his. Man who heard, let's go back for a minute. The Old Testament, I believe, is Adam's testimony. Why? Adam represents the fleshly nature. The kingdom was given over to the enemy through flesh, Adam, who chose to serve the enemy rather than God. Now, if you have that in the beginning, and you've got men who are writing the books, the word says only the flock hear the voice of the Father, but the Father is not in the Old Testament face value. He's hidden underneath, but not face value. That's the part that Harlan is representing, and he said he wished he'd been more of a father instead of a provider, physical versus spiritual. So, if the fleshly natured men are the ones in control of those books and they're writing them, what voice are they hearing? Because only the flock hear the voice of the Father. You're not the flock if you're of the fleshly nature. So this is why I'm saying that the Old Testament book is the testimony of Adam, the face value of it. Am I saying that none of it's good? No. It's the rules for living in the flesh in society without hurting others. But the rules were also given to the wicked. Why? Because those who are operating in love are doing their best not to break any of those rules, because they're living by the heart. So I believe that we can think into the future of what Walt will do, because yes, the house and the inheritance was given to Marta, yes. But Marta says, this family, I should take care of them, shouldn't I? Yes, and that's why Harlan gave her the inheritance, because he knew she would take care of the needs of the others. You leave the inheritance to those of the fleshly nature, are they going to take care of those of the spiritual? No. No, because they're going to be made slaves and servants. They're going to be looked down upon. So, I believe that Walt was going to take that publishing company, and that to run it, she would let him run it and write his own adaptations, the New Testament. It's just symbolic. Okay, and you can go with this or not. You don't have to. I'm sharing my mind and how I see things, and I'm hoping that someone else might actually see them too, because it's really, I watched the movie 8 times, and every time I saw something different. The Passover thing with Marta and the blood on her shoe was something I saw last, and it just struck me. And then, you know, the other thing with Ransom, I prayed about that. Why would he be the bad guy, but his name represents Yeshua's? And it's because he's playing duality, just like Yeshua was duality on the cross. He was the firstborn of the enemy that dies. That's our flesh. All flesh dies. That's never going to change. The perishable cannot inherit or the imperishable cannot inherit the perishable. You know what I mean? The flesh can't inherit the spiritual. But the spiritual inherits both. Just like the movie. So eventually Blanc tells the family, after all the evidence and confessions that the family had, okay, that's what I wanted to go back to. Ransom, he already knew from the beginning. He goes and he gets Marta and he's telling her, no, don't give it up. And he's got the bowl because he knows that she can't lie. And he asks her to tell him the truth. Okay? Now, let's go back to the garden. Adam is the first witness in accusing Marta, or accusing Eve. But Eve becomes the second witness that actually causes her to be found guilty when she admits and confesses her sin one to another. She's the second witness. Well, the same in this movie. Because she's confessed her sin to Ransom, who already knows what happened because he's the one that switched the vials. Okay? Now, if you go back to the garden, the same thing basically happens in a different way. Because if you understand that the serpent that Eve becomes one with in the garden before she gives the fruit to Adam, she's flesh of Adam's flesh. The fruit in the garden that she's giving to him physically is her body. She's becoming one with flesh, Adam. So she becomes guilty because Adam accuses her. And she has to take the blame if she's going to honor the law of love. And woe to those who caused one of my little ones to fall. She fell because she was forced to blame herself, and she's flesh too. This is how she's breaking the rules. So you go to the movie, it's the same thing. Ransom burns the building. Fire is judgment. It's like he's judging her as being guilty, but he knows that she's not. And he's getting rid of the evidence by judging her. It's the same thing with Adam. He's getting rid of the evidence that she's innocent because he's accusing her, and her operating in love, she's going to be the second witness that seals the deal that she's guilty. So it's getting rid of the evidence that she's innocent. But the toxology report, that's the blood work, says that she administered the correct pain medicine because she was the proper nurse. She operated in love. So again, you know, I find that just really beautiful how those go together, and how if you know the story, you know what happened, you can see God's story in the movie. It's two movies in one. Okay, so let me read my notes real quick. Okay, Richard and Linda, Harlan's daughter, Richard was the one cheating. His name means strong ruler, leader, king, strong, brave, powerful. Okay, Richard would be likened to Adam, who's a ruler rather than a husband. And you can go back to Harlan. In the slitting of his throat, he's basically killed himself. Adam killed himself. He wasn't actually killed by God. By his choice of killing Eve with his words, he killed himself. He slit his own throat. It's the same thing. So these things are being portrayed the same. Richard basically says, if you break the law, it doesn't matter how good your heart is. You have to face the consequences. Okay, so again, that's rules and regulations which give you a knowledge of good and evil, as opposed to the heart, which is about love. It's all through this movie. Okay, let's see here. Oh, and my favorite part of the movie is at the end when she's found not guilty. And of course he tries to kill her and doesn't succeed. I talked about that. But it's the cup that says, my house, my rules, my coffee. Now she inherits the house and everything in it. That cup is important because it's talking about two different ways to run a house. Harlan's way of running the house was the rules, which often he lost to Marta because Marta played a game of love, whereas Harlan played a game of his own rules and regulations. It's the old versus the new. And when he gives the house and everything in it to Marta, she's standing there and the whole family's looking up at her. They looked down at her before as the help. Now they're looking up at her and she's drinking out of that cup. My house, my rules, my coffee. And what does coffee do? It wakes you up. We're all going to wake up. If we're in the fleshly nature, we're going to wake up to the spiritual. And if we're in the spiritual nature, we're eventually going to wake up to the fact that we need to put some boundaries up physically to protect ourselves and to be able to live this life with people that are not exactly like us. So, I don't know if you got out of it what I did, but oh my gosh. This movie, the first time I saw these things was when the movie first came out. And I believe God put it on my heart simply because of the part of Passover. Because basically when you go back to the story of Esther and she tells Mordecai to fast and pray for 3 days and nights, and he said he did everything she asked and he crossed over or passed over. It's all about walking in love. You pass over your neighbors so that you can be passed over. Marta did this perfectly. Was she perfect? No. There was evidence that needed to be covered to cover her tracks, and Harlan asked her to do it. She was doing it to honor him. But he picked her because she would be a better steward of the wealth. And that's the same in the Bible. God's replacement theology. He's replacing those of the fleshly nature at judgment. Now, at judgment, what's going to happen is they're going to become the spiritual nature. It's called circumcision of the heart. But we're getting to that point where it's going to be painful, and I'm sure with this video, I'm sending out a lot of the flies and the locusts and all those things to the people that really don't want to hear what I'm saying. And it's okay. You don't have to hear it. And I know it's going to be flies annoying the hell out of you and locusts just eating away at your skin. The lice are just eating away at you. But eventually, circumcision of the heart is coming if you don't want to hear the message. Because this is the message. And I'm going to keep doing videos like this of more and more movies that are giving pieces of the puzzle from the Bible. So that you can understand this is not about religion. It really isn't. Those different things, Passover and the different feasts, explain what we are supposed to be doing with each other in life. The temple, the third temple to be built, is a spiritual temple, not a physical temple. It's a spiritual temple of all of us walking the way of salvation and redemption, Yeshua, within us. So I hope that you have gotten something out of the explanation. I hope I get better at it. I always get extremely nervous about doing videos. I don't really like being on camera. I don't like taking pictures, but you know what? You got to do what you got to do. When you're called to do something, you have to be obedient, and that's what I'm trying to do. So I hope that you have enjoyed this, and I will be back with another movie. I'm hoping that the next one is going to cover the movie called Criminal with Kevin Costner in it. Really good one. It's an older movie. It was one of the first movies that I saw the biblical story in. So I think it's worthy of covering. It'll be a lot shorter because there's not as many details. Back to this past movie, Linda was the one, she's like her father. She built her business from the ground up, Adam to Eve, spiritual. She's also the one that was a light sleeper. Remember that we're supposed to be awake till the end. She woke up all 3 times in the middle of the night, also symbolic of waking up at those trumpet calls. So we must wake up, people. We must wake up so we can hear the true testimony of the whole truth and not just part of the truth. The physical is just part of the truth. And if you only have part of the truth, what do you have? You have a lie. We need the whole truth. So with that being said, I hope that you've been blessed, that you've enjoyed it. And I thank you for being with me, liking, sharing, subscribing, and pray for me that I can continue to do this. Thank you. Have a blessed day.